Chapter 14 of The Romance of Modern Engineering. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr Natte. The Romance of Modern Engineering by Archibald Williams. Chapter 14. The Panama Canal. It is interesting to observe how considerate and at the same time unkind Nature has been to man in her mode of moulding the earth's surface and in the distribution of sea and land. She appears to have been undecided as to the relative advantages of an isthmus and a strait. At Suez she almost severed Asia from Africa, and then at the very last moment left a narrow neck of sandy desert. In Greece she ordained that the two portions should be connected so that men might pass from one to the other dry-shod. Then, with sudden whim, she separated Africa from Europe at Gibraltar, cut Great Britain off from the continent, while on the farther side of the Atlantic the two Americas were permitted to keep a gentle grip on one another at Panama. It would perhaps be difficult to decide whether, taking human history as a whole, the junction of land with land has proved more useful than the union of sea with sea, whether the Gibraltar Gap has benefited the Mediterranean countries more than it has hampered Spain and North West Africa, whether the Bosphorus and Dardanelles have advanced Russia more than they have retarded Turkey and Asia Minor, whether Egyptian civilization gained or lost by the sandy strip at Suez, whether the Central American neck was or was not a boon to the continents it connects. One thing is certain, that as soon as a nation takes to the sea, it feels the shackles of a neighbouring isthmus. The Pharaohs endeavoured to join the Nile to the Red Sea. Xerxes and Nero in turn tried to breach the Isthmus of Corinth. During the last 50 years uninterrupted land communication has been repeatedly sacrificed to the waterway, at Suez, at Corinth, in the Danish peninsula, in Holland. Since the shortening of a voyage by hundreds or maybe thousands of miles far more than counterbalances the inconvenience of confining road and rail traffic to a few bridges. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 marks an important epoch in the world's commercial history, one fraught too with great political importance. East and West could now join hands by sea without having to embrace the Cape of Good Hope. England and India are now but weeks instead of months apart. The story of the Suez Canal has been told so often that a brief recapitulation will here suffice. Its central figure is Monsieur Ferdinand de Lesseps, who resembled the great Brunel in the magnitude of his schemes, and like him was led by the energy of his genius into miscalculations of the costs of his projects. In spite of discouragement, technical, political, and financial, Monsieur Lesseps insisted that his plan was practical, and that the desert sand could be kept at bay by dredgers once the channel had been completed and filled with water. By employing the latest mechanical contrivances he pushed forward a cutting, 75 feet wide at bottom, from the fine harbour specially built at Port Said through the shallows of Lake Menzale, across 15 miles of desert, through Lake Bala and more desert, to the long Bitter Lakes, whence a third stretch penetrated sandy waste to Suez. During the 6 months that intervened between the opening of the canal and the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Monsieur de Lesseps was the hero of Europe. The newspapers with one consent sang his praises. Crowned heads smiled upon him, honours fell fast and thick. Wherever he went, banquets and entertainments were his portion, especially in England, the country that benefited most by the successful conclusion of his enterprise. But Nemesis was pursuing the over-fortunate engineer. Like Marius, the saviour of Rome, he was destined to outlive his reputation, and feel the bitterness of a fall from hero worship to degradation in the eyes of his countrymen. His star had, unknown to him, began to set when he first cast eyes on the narrow Isthmus of Panama. Since Núñez de Balboa discovered the Pacific in 1513, that barrier between the oceans had already been the subject of many plans for connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the 16th century Gomera, the historian, suggested a canal, which was also part of the project of William Patterson, the founder of the ill-starred Darien scheme of 1695. During the 18th century the piercing of the isthmus was discussed in Spain and elsewhere by men too numerous to mention. But only after the revolution in commercial relations throughout the world, produced by the opening of the Suez Canal, did there appear any chance of transforming design into fact. In 1885 an American company constructed a railway from Colón, formerly Aspinwall, on the Atlantic, to Panama on the Pacific coast, at the cost of £2.5 millions. Mr. A. Gallenga, writing in 1880, thus describes the country through which it passes: "The traveller has hardly left Colón 5 minutes before he finds himself wafted through the tangle of a primeval forest, by turns a swamp, a jungle, a savannah, yet a garden and a paradise. A strange jumble of whatever nature can muster most varied, most gorgeous in colours, and sweetest in odours to delight immense senses. Colón is built on a marshy island, separated from the mainland by a creek, which the train crosses soon after quitting the station. For a little while the land lies low, soaked at this season with green or yellow fever-breeding stagnant water, the surface of which is carpeted all over with those floating plants which the gardener's skill rears with infinite pains in English hothouses. But soon the ground rises and breaks up into gentle knolls, so densely wooded as to make the country round one impervious mass of green. The rank, hopelessly intricate vegetation invades every inch of space, pressing close to the very rails of the line, and in deep cuttings, or in the hollows of the valleys, hanging so intrusively over it, that in some places the company must be at no little trouble to make good its right of way, well aware that were it to slacken its exertions, the whole track would be speedily obliterated. There is nothing imagination can conjure up to match the variety of the green hues, the vividness of the wild flowers of that virgin forest, nothing to equal the chaos of that foliage, as roots, stems, and branches crowd upon and struggle with one another, the canopy overhead being further tangled by hosts of lianas and other trailing parasites, blending leaf with leaf and thread with thread, like the warp and woof of a carpet. Since the railway route will be the subject of the following pages, as materially the same as that selected for the Panama Canal, its physiographic features may be also briefly noted. The isthmus between Colón and Panama witnesses a diminution of the backbone of the Americas, the Rockies and the Andes, to an elevation scarcely worthy the name of a hill. On the Colón side the country for 20 miles rises very gradually. On the Pacific slope the ascent is more abrupt, reaching its highest point of 333 feet above sea level in the now notorious Cerro de Culebra, and then sinking, with occasional upward gradients, to San Pablo. At Obispo the rail encounters the river Chagres, the course of which it follows at intervals northwards to Gatun, where the two separate at right angles. The influence of the river and Culebra Hill on the construction of the canal will presently be noticed. In 1850 a treaty known as the Clayton Bulwer was signed between the United States and Great Britain, guaranteeing the neutrality of any canal cut across the isthmus. 26 years later the French, elated by the success of the Suez Canal, organized in Paris an association to survey the isthmus with regard to the feasibility of a ship canal. A lieutenant in the French army, Messieurs Lucien and Bonapartiste, was despatched to Central America to make the necessary investigations, and approached the Colombian Government on the subject of a concession to the association of rights to carry out his recommendations. The Government granted a charter whereby the grantees obtained the free concession of all public lands required for the construction and service to the canal, of a belt of land 219 yards wide on each side of its banks throughout the entire length, and 1¼ million acres in localities to be chosen by the company. The concession was to endure for 99 years from the opening of the canal, after which period the canal would become the absolute property of the Government. The following conditions were, however, imposed: A. That the rights could not be transferred to any nation or foreign government. B. That the canal should be finished within 12 years of the formation of a constructive company. When Messier Wyss returned to Europe with his plans and treaty, Monsieur Ferdinand de Lesseps, now 75 years of age, was chosen chairman of a committee, and at once organized an international congress to discuss the several schemes for constructing a ship canal. The chairman urged the adoption of a canal at sea level, which would resemble the Suez in its ease of navigation. It may be observed that several of the delegates strongly recommended a canal with locks. The authority and enthusiasm of Lesseps, however, carried the day, and the public was invited to subscribe 400 million francs. But investors hung back until after the chairman had personally visited the Isthmus and decided the route of the canal, when 600,000 shares of 500 francs each were quickly taken up. Thus was born an association destined to impoverish thousands of thrifty families, to besmirch the fair name of a great nation, to lead it to the very verge of a revolution, and rob it of any pride and glory in the completion of a work of world-wide utility and importance. To those who review the situation, how pathetic it appears. Upwards of 200,000 people investing, many their little all, in an undertaking foredoomed by peculation and corruption to failure; the famous engineer leading this great band of investors to a common ruin, as in 1870 Napoleon had drawn out his troops to meet disaster at the hands of the Prussians; the struggle against misfortune after misfortune; the final financial sedan, that left behind it memories scarcely less bitter than those of the Année Terrible 1870 to 1871. The period from 1881 to 1888 makes sad reading in the history of the canal. In 1880 Messier de Lesseps estimated the total cost at 843 million francs, 34 million pounds. The following year he placed the figures at 20.5 million pounds, in 1885 at 28 million. By 1886 31 million pounds had been spent, by 1887 40 million pounds. When the crash came, the total share and loan capital actually raised had reached the enormous total of 2 billion francs, and the work was not a quarter done. The causes of this gigantic disaster, that desolated thousands of humble French homes, are manifold. First, the deadly climate, pithily described as that of two seasons, the wet, when people die of yellow fever in 4 or 5 days, and the dry, when people die of pernicious fever in from 24 to 36 hours. During 2 seasons the daily burial rate averaged 30 to 40, and that for weeks together. Then the dishonesty of those in high places, which came out in the subsequent trials, and the misappropriation of funds and wilful waste. The expenditure, says Dr. Nelson, had been something simply colossal. One Director General lived in a mansion that cost over £20,000. His pay was £10,000 a year, and every time he went out on the line he had his déplacement, which gave him the liberal sum of £10 a day additional. One canal chief had built a famous pigeon house while I was on the Isthmus recently. It cost the company £3,000. Another man had built a bath house on the most approved principles. This cost £8,000. $5 million have been spent in creating a very pretty, well-kept tropical town at Christophe Colomb. Sidings are covered with valuable engines and all kinds of movable plant, which are out in all weathers and going to ruin. Equally fatal were the physical obstacles afforded by the Culebra Hill and the river Chagres. The summit, cut on the axis of the canal for about half a mile, has an average cutting of 100 meters, 330 feet, or 360 feet from the bottom of the canal. The width of this cut, being on the hillside, at the surface of the ground is about 300 meters, 904 feet, and the depth for a few hundred feet on the highest point in this cross section is about 164 meters, 538 feet, from the bed of the canal. In 1888 only 34 million cubic meters had been excavated out of an estimated total of 161 million cubic meters, and of the material removed 4/5 was soft and easily worked. The Culebra section, of hard rock, had been scarcely touched, and it was calculated that 470 million francs would still have to be disbursed for the completion of it. An equal amount must also be devoted to the taming of the Chagres, the river that crossed the course of the canal no less than 29 times. The Chagres, like all tropical streams, is liable to sudden and excessive fluctuations. The original scheme included the damming of the river at Gamboa, and a diversion that should discharge it into the Colón Bay. The height of the dam was to be 150 feet above the bed of the river, and its cost about £4,000,000. The diversion channels, 25 miles long, had a dimension almost equal to that of the canal proper, in order to carry off the freshets resulting from a rainfall of sometimes 6 inches a day. Some idea of the body of water such a fall entails will be gained from the fact that in November 1879 the Panama Railway was covered to a depth of nearly 18 feet for about 30 miles. In 1888 M. de Lesseps reluctantly abandoned his original scheme of a sea level canal in favour of one with locks, which would reduce largely the amount of excavation in the Culebra cutting. But public confidence had been shaken, and after his compulsory resignation of the chairmanship in 1889, the shareholders resolved that the company should go into liquidation. The liquidators at once took measures to bring some sort of order into the financial chaos, and to organize a new company. The Colombian Government enacted that the latter should have 10 years, dating from 1894, in which to complete its enterprise. The plans were now drastically altered. By means of an embankment across the valley of the Chagres near Boyo, the country between that place and Obispo would be converted into a huge lake, to serve as part of the canal and a reservoir for the storage of flood water. In case of need, a second dam would be added at Alajuela, 9 miles above Obispo. A waste weir was to carry off the surplus water of the new lake into a special channel, and the lake itself would be reached from the lower levels by 4 locks on the Pacific side at Paraíso, Pedro Miguel, and Miraflores, and by an equal number on the Atlantic side at Boyo and Obispo. This scheme would entail the diversion of the railway for a distance of 31 miles to skirt the lake, and a total expenditure of over £20,000,000. Work on the canal was never stopped. At its slackest times more than 1,000 men found employment. From 1899 to 1902 the working force averaged 2,200 men, so that the picture of plant and excavations left entirely to the tender mercies of nature must be written down as an unpleasant fiction. While the new company was quietly pursuing its programme, the United States had instituted surveys of the Nicaragua-Costa Rica Canal region, in order to humour the patriotic cry for a States-owned and controlled interoceanic canal. In 1899, however, all bills for the construction of a Nicaraguan canal were rejected in favour of a measure providing for a further investigation of the whole question, including the survey of the Isthmus de Novo. The President, Mr. McKinley, acting on powers conferred, appointed a commission of 9 members, which in 1901 recommended the construction of a canal through Lake Nicaragua with a total length of 183 2/3 miles, the cost to be about £40,000,000. This alarmed the Panama stockholders, and in 1902 they decided to offer their property and concessions to the United States in consideration of a sum of $40 millions. Public opinion being then completely reversed by this offer, the President was authorized to acquire for the United States, at a cost not exceeding the sum demanded, all the rights and privileges, unfinished work, plant, and other property of the new Panama Company on the Isthmus, including the railway; to acquire from the Republic of Columbia exclusive and perpetual control of a strip of land not less than 6 miles wide from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and to construct a canal of such depth and capacity as would afford convenient passage to ships of the greatest tonnage and draught then in use. Thus ended the second chapter in the history of the canal, and France, through the grievous mismanagement of the period 1880 to 1888, lost an opportunity of acquiring influence of Central America and upon the American continent generally, which in all probability will never again fall within her grasp. Columbia had still to be reckoned with. As long as the Nicaraguan scheme was seriously entertained by the United States, the Bogotá Government showed itself most anxious to concede almost anything that might be asked. But when the offer of the canal had been made by the company, these professions ceased, and harder terms were demanded. Colombia continued to haggle for conditions that the United States could not grant. Her pecuniary demands were satisfied by a compromise, and her nominal sovereignty preserved by a diplomatic fiction. But before the United States Government could commit itself to so prodigious an undertaking as the completion of the canal, it naturally enough required a guarantee that its occupation of the canal territory should be permanent. The offer of the Canal Company having been formally accepted in February 1903, a treaty was signed by the States in the following month, as the result of energetic measures on the part of President Roosevelt, and all that remains to be done at the time of writing these lines is its ratification by the Colombian Government before the work on the canal can be definitely undertaken by the Americans. The commission appointed in 1899 rejected the sea level scheme of M. de Lesseps as entailing a computed expenditure of £48,000,000 for the completion of the canal. In its place they suggested a modification of the plans laid before the new company in 1894, which would require an outlay of about £30,000,000. The project for completion. In deciding the dimensions of the canal, the United States Commission considered the future rather than the present types of the world's shipping. Though cargo vessels do not, in the main, increase their length and beam so rapidly as passenger fast liners, their individual tonnage sensibly augments from year to year, since experience proves that large cargoes are handled more economically than small. The depth of the canal was therefore fixed at 35 feet throughout, and the minimum bottom width at 150 feet. In Panama Bay the width will be increased to 200 feet, though at high tide there will be a channel 320 feet wide. The side slopes will vary between 1:1 in soft earth to 4:1 in hard rock. On curves where more steering room is required, the channel will be broadened in proportion to the diminution of the radius of the curve. The locks, of which 5 flights are included in the plans, will raise vessels from the 2 and sea level sections to the central stretch, 21 2/3 miles long, extending from Boyo to Pedro San Miguel. This section, which includes the Culebra Emperador cutting, will have a bottom level 47 feet above mean sea level, so that the 2 locks at Boyo will give a united lift of some 82 to 90 feet according to the altitude of the surface of the central reach. On the Pacific side the transference will be made by 2 locks at Pedro San Miguel and 1 at Miraflores. The locks are to be doubled at every step, so as to permit simultaneous travel in both directions, and obviate any total cessation of traffic in case of repairs to any one lock being necessary. They will have a clear length of 740 feet, a width of 84 feet, and a depth equal to that of the canal over the sills. For the quicker passage of smaller vessels, a subdivision by intermediate gates is contemplated. All locks will be founded on rock, walled with concrete, and fed by culverts through which water will rush at a maximum speed of 40 miles an hour, a severe test of the quality of the lining. It has been mentioned above that the 2 greatest difficulties encountered on the canal by the Lesseps Company were the stemming of the river Chagres and the piercing of the rocky eminence at Culebra. The American scheme for overcoming these obstacles is distinguished by its boldness of design and the opportunity that it will afford for a remarkable display of engineering skill. At Boyo the course of the Chagres will be crossed by a dam thrown from side to side of the valley. The effect of this dam must be to pen up the waters until a lake is formed, rapidly increasing its area as it becomes deeper. It has been calculated that, with an annual traffic of 10,000,000 tons, there will be required for the working of the locks an average supply of 1,063 cubic feet per second. The annual average flow of the Chagres is about 3,200 cubic feet per second, but at the dry season it decreases to less than 1/6 of that amount. The United States Commission therefore decided that the lake should be of such dimensions as to afford storage for 3,654,720,000 cubic feet, the total deficiency during the 3 months of February, March, and April, in addition to the amount requisite to maintain a channel of a minimum depth of 35 feet. The height of the dam will therefore be such as to withstand a head of 90 feet of water, its top having an elevation of 100 feet above mean sea level. As the water collected by the lake would naturally flow off at the lowest point after attaining a certain depth, it has been determined to bar that point, near the head of the Rio Gigante, by a weir, the height of which will be 85 feet above mean sea level. When the water of the lake is even with the crest of the weir, it will cover 38½ square miles, but in time of heavy flood, with a discharge 5 feet deep over the weir crest, the area will be enlarged to 43 square miles. The water pouring over the weir, which is to be 2,000 feet long, will pass into artificial channels, connecting a succession of swamps until the neighbourhood of Gatun is reached, where it will once again enter the bed of the Chagres. The most important feature of this scheme is the Great Boyo Dam. At the summit, 2,546 feet long, it will have a total height above the foundation of 228 feet on its central line, where the earthwork forming the bulk of the construction is to be reinforced by a masonry core driven down to hard rock. The earth faces are designed to have mean slopes of 1 vertical to 3 horizontal, broken by benches, each 6 feet wide. Although it is necessary to pave only the upstream face, it is probable that both faces will be revetted with rock spoils from the site of the Boyo locks. The masonry core will be 30 feet thick at and below -30, that is, 30 feet below sea level, tapering from that level to 8 feet at the top. The proposed method of construction involves many novel and untried features, the extension of pneumatic work to probably unprecedented depths, and special details in making tight joints between the caissons. The difficulties, very great under ordinary circumstances, will probably be considerably enhanced by climatic and other surroundings. It is calculated that the construction of this enormous barrier will entail the removal and placing in position of 2,200,000 million cubic yards of material, of which nearly 300,000 cubic yards will be represented by concrete. The cost, 1,210,230 feet-pounds, will equal that of the Nile Dam, and the cubical contents of both are about the same. The creation of the lake will of course enormously decrease the amount of excavation originally estimated by M. Le Lesseps, yet a huge quantity of quarrying will be necessary at the famous Emperador Culebra cutting, where the bottom of the canal will still be 286 feet below the natural surface of the ground. To quote Mr. Lee once more, from many points of view the Emperador Culebra cuttings may be regarded as unique in the annals of engineering, for never has the hand of man essayed a task of like character and more striking dimensions. It involves labour necessarily costly and prolonged, and its main interest to engineers centres in the remarkable opportunity which the undertaking will afford for organization, methods, and tools specially adapted for the work. The amount of excavation involved in the completion of the cutting is estimated at about 43,237,200 cubic yards, or nearly 45% of the aggregate of all classes of material which must be removed prior to the opening of the waterway. It is believed that by methods of excavation usually resorted to, the cutting can be completed in 8 years, exclusive of a period of 2 years for preparation and unforeseen delays. Much of the excavation will be through rock, but the strata of clay encountered will require an equal expenditure in labour, as their unstable nature necessitates the lining of the slopes throughout the entire length of the cutting with masonry retaining walls, built nearly vertically on a series of broad ledges, rising one above the other on either flank. The Panama Railroad, which must be rebuilt for 15½ miles between Boyo and Obispo to avoid the lake, will, after passing the latter town, run for 6 miles or so along one of the ledges on the east side of the cutting. Out of the $144,233,258 million to be devoted to the completion of the canal, the 6 miles of deepest cutting will consume $42 million, more than the aggregate cost of the Boyo Dam, all the locks, the Gigante weir, and the other work to be done between Boyo and the Miraflores. Had nature but omitted the Cerro de Culebra for her scheme, it is probable that for years past vessels would have crossed from ocean to ocean. At Colon a large harbour will be built to improve the entrance to the canal and protect it from the northers of the Gulf of Mexico. At the Panama end, 4½ miles of dredging will be requisite to carry the canal to the 6-fathom line in the bay. The time occupied by vessels in passing through the canal will vary with their size, the permissible speed decreasing with the increase of the ship's tonnage. It has been calculated that, allowing 5¼ hours for lockage, the Pacific and Atlantic will be but 11¼ to 14¼ hours apart, according to the dimensions of the steamer. The projected Nicaragua Canal, now finally abandoned, would have had a length of 187 miles between Greytown on the Caribbean Sea and Brito on the Pacific. Of this distance the lake would occupy 70 miles, and the canalized San Juan River an equal proportion. It was proposed to dam the San Juan at Conchuda, and to throw some 50 miles of its course into the same level as the lake, 104 to 110 feet above mean sea level. 4 locks between Conchuda and an equal number between the lake and Brito were to transfer the traffic from the lower to the higher level. The disadvantages attaching to this route were: A. The cost, double of that required for the completion of the Panama Canal. B. The great difficulty of controlling so large a body of water as Lake Nicaragua. C. The large number of locks, combining with the total length of the canal to make. D. The passage of the canal a matter of at least 30 hours. Under this latter head it may be noticed that though the distance from San Francisco to New York is 377 miles greater via Panama than by Nicaragua, the duration of the journey by water would be about the same in both cases. There cannot be the least doubt that the United States have acted prudently in surrendering all ideas of a canal constructed throughout by Yankee capital and engineers, and deciding to bend their efforts to the completion of a work partially carried out by the ill-starred French companies. What will be the effects of the perfected canal on the commerce of the globe it is indeed hard to calculate, but that it will prove an immense stimulus to interoceanic trade, by breaching the 9,000-mile barrier of the American continent at the most convenient point, is not to be doubted. The States, as controllers of the canal, will gain an immense strategic advantage, since they will be able to throw their fleet from one ocean to the other as required. Furthermore, all their ports will benefit largely, since those on the west will then command a shortened route to Africa, and those on the east be much nearer the East Asian markets than formerly. In fact, for all practical purposes, Panama will be the great gateway between the east and the west. Yet the canal will not command a monopoly of the carrying trade across Central America, since a rival is already in the field, and what is more, actually at work. In the south of Mexico, east of the Yucatan promontory, the two oceans are within 160 miles of each other. The great Cortés, having finally sought a natural channel, conceived the idea of constructing a carriage road across this comparatively narrow neck, so as to put Spain in communication with the Spice Islands of the East Indies. He accordingly bought up land on the Coatzacoalcos River and round Tehuantepec, from which the isthmus takes its name, with an eye to profit by the road, which was, however, not actually made until 5 centuries later, when the discovery of gold in California and the dangers of travel across the northern prairies rendered such an undertaking an absolute necessity. At a later date Captain Eads proposed a railway over which ships should be transported bodily from ocean to ocean, borne on trucks running over several parallel tracks, each furnished with one or more locomotives. The vessel was to be transferred to land from the water by means of a pontoon carrying a cradle furnished with wheels running on 6 lines of rails. As soon as the pontoon had been raised to the height at which its rails and those on shore were on the same level, the cradle and its ship would be moved from the one set to the other, and all would be ready for the land journey. It is needless to follow the details of the scheme further, as it proved abortive. In 1895 the Mexican Government completed an ordinary type railroad across the Tehuantepec Isthmus from Coatzacoalcos on the north to Salina Cruz on the south. but owing to the lack of proper terminal harbours, the traffic on either track was disappointing. At that end, Sir Weetman Pearson, head of the London firm of S. Pearson and Son, was engaged in the wonderful harbour of Vera Cruz, described at length elsewhere in these pages. He entered into an agreement with the Government for improving matters in the Isthmus, the Mexican authorities undertaking to expend £300 million on the harbours, and an additional £500,000 on the railway, his firm to carry out the contracts and furnish whatever money might be further necessary to put the line in first-class working order. This partnership will last for 50 years, after which period the whole of the property will pass under the sole control of the Government. The latter, on its part, binds itself not to grant during this time any concession for the construction of other railways and ports within 30 miles of the Tehuantepec works, but it reserves the right of employing any ships of the company in event of war in consideration of a monthly remuneration, and of transporting coal, troops, and emigrants at reduced rates, mails to be carried free. The railroad crosses the Isthmus at the narrowest part of Mexico, covering a distance of only 192 miles, so that freight received from one ocean will be able to be shipped in the other ocean within the short space of 24 hours. Owing to necessary windings in places, the road is 50 miles longer than a straight line between the extreme points. In spite of the fact that the country in some parts, particularly on the Pacific side, reaches an altitude of 3,000 feet, the highest elevation of the track is but 852 feet above sea level. The harbour works are expected to be completed in 1904, when the terminal ports of Coatzacoalcos and Salina Cruz will be converted into first-class seaports, accessible in all weathers. At the former place the natural harbour is good, and there is only 15 feet of water on the bar at low tide. Dredging operations are being carried on to give the channel a depth of from 30 to 40 feet. Along the river front, quays 2/3 of a mile in length are being constructed. At Salina Cruz very extensive works are necessary, as the port has to be constructed in an open bay, with breakwaters similar to those in Vera Cruz. The Mexican Government intends to make the towns worthy to be called interoceanic route stations, and to render them as healthy as possible by a pure water supply, and enforce regulations for the paving and cleansing of the streets. The Government has granted a concession to Sir Weetman Pearson to construct a line from Ojapa on the Tehuantepec Railway to Alvarado on the river San Juan, which is already in direct communication with Mexico City via Vera Cruz. There will thus be two ports on the Gulf from which goods can be forwarded to Salina Cruz on the Pacific. The prospects of the Tehuantepec Railway may be deduced from the following considerations. In the first place, the Tehuantepec Isthmus is 1,300 miles north of Panama, and therefore much nearer the trade centres of the United States than the Canal will be. The difference in mileage between certain points by the railway and by the Canal may thus be stated. New York to San Francisco, by Tehuantepec, miles 4,925, by Panama, miles 6,107. New York to Honolulu, by Tehuantepec, miles 6,566, by Panama, miles 7,705. New York to Hong Kong, by Tehuantepec, miles 11,597, by Panama, miles 12,645. Liverpool to San Francisco, by Tehuantepec, miles 8,274, by Panama, miles 9,071. New Orleans to Acapulco, by Tehuantepec, miles 1,453, by Panama, miles 3,983. New Orleans to San Francisco, by Tehuantepec, miles 5,596, by Panama, miles 3,586. Though Coatzacoalcos on the Atlantic is 800 miles south of New Orleans, it is nearer than that town to San Francisco. Secondly, the sea-to-sea charges of the Panama Railway are about 20 shillings per ton; of the United States Railways, 60 shillings per ton. It is expected that the transference will be made on the Tehuantepec line for 16 shillings, and if to this be added 10 shillings per ton as the cost of the Pacific Ocean journey from Salina Cruz to San Francisco, the shipper will be able to pass goods from the latter town to the Gulf at the total charge of 26 shillings, or but one half of all rail transit via Mexico City and Vera Cruz. It is obvious from these figures that the Panama Railway, even if it reduces its charges, will not compete seriously with the northern route, which, at least until the opening of the Canal, an event not likely to occur for 12 years or more, will obtain the bulk of the ocean to ocean carrying trade. CHAPTER XV.